So UFC 293 is only about a couple of months away, and we don't really have many fights announced yet for the card, so I'm going to be going through all of the fights that have been announced, but also I have built the perfect UFC 293 card. It is super stacked, definitely worth the pay-per-view, and I do think that it would be a fantastic card if it were to go forward, and I do think this is a realistic pay-per-view card to make as well, on top of everything as well as that. Now, there is very interesting that we don't have the main event yet, and we don't have a pre-sale yet as well, and I feel like it's because we're waiting on certain fighters to fight. Maybe we're waiting on the result of Alexander Volkanovski's next title defense. Maybe we're waiting on the result of UFC 290, where potentially Robert Whittaker or Dricus du Plessis will be fighting Israel Adesanya. But I have built the perfect card for UFC 293, and there is options. You can mix and match a couple of these fighters with different opponents, but I've got every single fight has actually got an Australian or a fighter from New Zealand on it, which does kind of make things a little bit more local. However, I do feel like maybe the final card might still just have an international fight anyway, but we'll get into the card that I've constructed. In the first fight, which is going to be the main event, is going to be Israel Adesanya taking on Robert Whittaker. Now, I do believe if Dricus du Plessis did manage to beat Robert Whittaker, that would be the fight to make. Israel Adesanya versus Dricus du Plessis. And I'm still not even opposed to the idea of Israel Adesanya maybe moving up a weight class and fighting Jamal Hill in Australia as well. But what we do know is that Israel Adesanya has been targeted to fight on this card. We do know that he's been targeted to potentially fight Dricus du Plessis, but the UFC has made Whittaker versus Dricus du Plessis. So I think that the UFC probably should have just done Izzy versus du Plessis instead of having Whittaker potentially spoil the party. And I do think if Whittaker does defeat Dricus du Plessis, he probably will get the next title shot. However, another thing that you could say is maybe Sean Strickland or Abus Magomedov could leapfrog Robert Whittaker and be the next in line. Maybe even Jared Cannonier for a rematch, because it is kind of getting pretty close. It's only 2 months away, and a lot of these guys that are preparing for title fights might want a little bit longer. So it might genuinely just be Israel Adesanya versus whoever wants to fight him and is somewhat deserving so. But I think the best fight that you could make is Izzy versus Dricus du Plessis or Izzy versus Whittaker. The winner of that fight, I think it's going to be Whittaker. Now we move on to the co-main event. That is going to be Alex Volkanovski versus Ilia Topuria. Ilia Topuria has gone out and said that he would be willing to fight Alexander Volkanovski in Australia. And Alexander Volkanovski is a guy that likes to be active. Now, there is a lot of things that could maybe change this up. Maybe Alexander Volkanovski fights at UFC 294 in Dubai and Abu Dhabi and fights and takes on Islam Makhachev. But I think maybe he would be more likely to defend his bout against Ilia Topuria in Australia, and then maybe he could fight Aljamain Sterling early next year. Maybe he could just move up to 155 pounds early next year and take on the winner of Islam Makhachev versus whoever he's going to be fighting, which probably will be Islam Makhachev. But the point is, in a very ideal world, I think the co-main event would be have Alexander Volkanovski involved in some way, and I think the most realistic option right now is Alexander Volkanovski versus Ilia Topuria in the co-main event. And I think that would be fantastic top two fights, right? That would sell a lot of pay-per-views by itself, but it does still continue to get better. The next fight is going to be Tuivasa versus Alexander Volkov. If you guys don't know, Sydney is Tuivasa's town. Like, he's got like Drink West, Western Sydney, from the area, Western Sydney. This guy is a Sydney guy, so you want to have him very high up on the card. If you can't get Volk, maybe Tuivasa is the co-main event. Tuivasa is going to have a massive name in Sydney. He's got a massive name in Australia, big name in New Zealand, just big name internationally. And Alexander Volkov is a guy that's ranked slightly below him, but you got to kind of think about this. Alexander Volkov is a guy that has proven to fight anyone, anywhere. He took on Tom Aspinall in England. Why would he not take on Tuivasa in Australia? Because in my opinion, it's actually a winnable matchup for Volkov. It's a very winnable matchup for Tuivasa, but it's also still a winnable matchup for Volkov as well. I think he would take the opportunity to be on a big pay-per-view card, and if he does fight Tuivasa, then the UFC kind of owes him a little bit of a favor, because he's doing them a favor by taking on a local guy overseas in a completely different country that he's probably never been to before. I think it's a good fight. I mean, aside from that, you could do Tuivasa looking way down the rankings. Like, maybe you could look way down the rankings to maybe Tuivasa versus Blagojevic, or Tuivasa versus even... Maybe you could even do Tuivasa versus Alexander Romanov. Like, you could look way down the rankings, but I think realistically, This is a good fight. Tuivasa taking on Alexander Volkov. I do like this matchup quite a bit. And then the next one is going to be Della Maddalena versus Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. Now, I think maybe a better matchup could be Della Maddalena versus Gilbert Burns. That is a matchup which I believe the MMA matchmaker on Instagram is trying to kind of make just on his UFC 293 card. So I'll give him a shout out for that. But I think Gilbert Burns is probably going to want to fight in Brazil, you know, because the Brazilian card, I believe, is only a couple of weeks after this card, if not a week or two after this card. So I think Gilbert Burns, around this time of the year, probably is going to want to fight in Brazil if he's not injured and if he can make a safe return to the octagon. So I think we're probably looking at Della Maddalena versus somebody that's not Gilbert Burns. I was almost thinking of Della Maddalena versus Vicente Luque. Maybe even Della Maddalena versus Neil Magny, but Della Maddalena versus Magny would be a big step down in competition if he beats Sean Brady, which I do think he does do. And Stephen Thompson's a guy that's pretty open about wanting to get a striker, and Della Maddalena is a striker. It would be a fantastic test for Della Maddalena. It would test Della Maddalena on the feet because, you know, Stephen Wonderboy Thompson's not just going to be there to get hit. You know what I mean? He's going to be there and he's going to be moving around and he's going to be able to pepper Della Maddalena from range potentially if JDM isn't able to close the distance. So there's kind of a lot that could potentially go on here in this fight. I think this is a good fight. I think it's somewhat realistic as well. Della Maddalena versus Gilbert Burns is probably better. Maybe it makes a little bit more sense, but the thing is, Gilbert Burns, I think he's probably going to want to fight in Brazil, and maybe he could fight somebody else in Brazil that's pretty highly ranked. So that's my explanation for that fight. The next one is Kai Kara-France versus Manel Kape. This has already been confirmed, and it's probably going to be on the main card. I mean, Manel Kape's ranked like number 9. Kai Kara-France is ranked like number 5 or something like that. So very high ranked flyweights. Kai Kara-France and Manel Kape, also pretty big names. They probably would add a bit of name value to the card as well if they are on the main card, which I do believe that they will be. And it's just a fight that's already been announced. It makes sense to be on the main card. Another fight that's already kind of been announced. Like, it's not official on Tapology, but I do believe Carlos Ulberg versus Da Un Jung has been officially announced. And I think this would be a great fight to close the main card because Carlos Ulberg, fantastic kickboxer. Da Un Jung, a decent boxer, a good boxer. It's going to be a striking fight. Someone's going to get finished either way, I would say. And I do think Carlos Ulberg will probably get a KO. But what you want in the featured fight of the prelims is guys or girls that are going to put on a great fight to sell more pay-per-views. I guarantee you Carlos Ulberg versus Da Un Jung is going to put on a good scrap where the people will watch and think, man, I want to see more of this. I'm going to buy the pay-per-view. So I think that would be a good option. Da Un Jung and Carlos Ulberg are both also somewhat big names. I would say Carlos Ulberg may be more popular because he has been on... No, he hasn't been on The Bachelor. He's been offered to be on The Bachelor, but he hasn't been on The Bachelor. Sorry, but anyway, the point is Carlos Ulberg is just a pretty popular guy in general, especially in Australia and New Zealand. Then we've got Casey O'Neill versus Viviane Araujo, a ranked fight in the women's flyweight division. Casey O'Neill, I believe she was born in Australia, but she seems to represent Scotland a little bit more. I'm a little bit confused with what she's up to, but anyway, the point is she's on this card, and I think it's a prelim fight. I would hate to see this on the main card, especially when there's so many good options, which I've already kind of displayed for you guys right there, and I've got more fights as well, which on a bad pay-per-view card potentially could be on the main card of a pay-per-view, but I think Casey O'Neill versus Viviane Araujo, very high up on the prelims, but I don't think it's a main card fight. I don't think it's a featured prelim fight because it wouldn't sell more pay-per-views, because it wouldn't be like a banger like Ulberg versus Jung would be. Also an officially announced fight as well, if I didn't mention that earlier. The next one is the rebooking of Justin Tafa versus Austin Lane. Now, this depends on how healthy Justin Tafa is, but this is a fight I wouldn't mind seeing run back because I do think this could be a very fun fight if it did happen. Unfortunately, it did happen, but it didn't really happen to how we kind of wanted it to happen. I think I'm pretty open to rebooking Tafa versus Lane. If you're not open to rebooking Tafa versus Lane, just replace Austin Lane with somebody else. Maybe you could do Justin Tafa versus somebody else. I mean, there's definitely other heavyweights out there that Justin Tafa hasn't fought yet, and I think there's definitely other options that you could do, but I really don't mind just rebooking Justin Tafa versus Austin Lane. It's a fight I wouldn't mind seeing run back because I do think it would be very, very fun. Now we can move on to the next fight. The opening of the normal prelims is Stephen Erceg versus Sue Madajiri. Now you might say, why not do Stephen Erceg versus Matt Schnell? Why not do Stephen Erceg versus who this and that and that? Stephen Usyk, he come in, had a very, very impressive win over David Wojcik in his debut, but now he sits at like number 14 in the rankings. And the thing is, Matt Schnell is ranked number 8. And in the main card, you've got Manuel Karp, who's ranked number 9, taking on number 5, Kai Kara-France. You don't really want to have, you know, Stephen Usyk taking on a guy that is higher ranked than somebody in the main card of the same. You know what I mean? Like, you don't really want that to happen. I think as well, Stephen Usyk versus Sumanajiri would be a good test for Stephen Usyk. It would really test us to know, is Stephen Usyk really top 15 level? I think he would beat Sumanajiri. I just don't want to see Stephen Usyk get rushed against Matt Schnell. I think maybe, I don't know, because Stephen Usyk just looked so good against Dvorak. It kind of blew my mind. I didn't expect him to look that good. But the point is, I think this is a more realistic fight than doing Stephen Usyk versus Matt Schnell. And I think it would be a fun fight as well, because Sumanajiri is a very fun fighter. But more importantly than anything else, it is a very, very winnable matchup for Stephen Usyk. And now we move on to Jacob Malkoun taking on Aliaskhab Khizriev. This is a fight that has kind of been officially announced. It's not on Tapology, but I believe it's been kind of rumored. It's been talked about. I believe this is a fight that's going to be happening. I think it should be on the main event of the early prelims. I mean, maybe you could put Jacob Malkoun versus Khizriev on the normal prelims, but I don't want to have... I'm going to spoil a fight that I've got earlier on. You don't want to have the tougher brothers fighting too close together, because they're both probably going to have the same corner, probably both going to have the same people in their corner, so you don't really want them fighting back-to-back or close to it. So I've got to separate those fights. Jacob Malkoun versus Aliaskhab Khizriev. It's a good fight that's already been made. I believe it will be made on this card. I mean, it's a good fight. It's a wrestling fight. I don't think it would be that exciting. And because I don't think it would be that exciting, you want it on the UFC Fight Pass prelims, like the early prelims before the normal prelims start. So that's why I've got it there. The next fight is Jack Jenkins taking on Chippy Mariscal. This is a fun fight, and it's a winnable fight for Jack Jenkins. And I'm not too sold on Jack Jenkins yet. I really wanted Jack Jenkins to impress me against Jamal Emmers so I could kind of jump on this Jack Jenkins hype train that's come out of nowhere. But unfortunately, he still hasn't quite sold me on his skill set yet. But if he beats Chippy Mariscal, that would be a good win. And the reason why that would be a good win is Chippy Mariscal is actually a great fighter. You know, he did go out there and beat True the Peak on short notice at 155 pounds. But Mariscal said that he's open to fighting at 145 or even 135 pounds next, which is crazy. But I think this will be a fun fight, you know, probably mostly a stand-up fight. You know, Chippy Mariscal does have good judo, though. He does have I believe it's like a judo black belt or something like that. You know, very good kickboxing, and Jack Jenkins has decent wrestling and also decent kickboxing as well. I think this would just be a fun fight, winnable fight for Jenkins. Dangerous fight for Jenkins, though, because Chippy Mariscal does have KO power. He wasn't able to knock out True the Peak, but True the Peak has an absolutely insane ability to absorb damage. It's insane. But it will just be a fun fight. I think Jack Jenkins versus Chippy Mariscal is fun. Otherwise, there is other options that you could do for Jack Jenkins, but I think you want to keep it somewhat safe, and also while he's still kind of working up the rankings. I guess you could say this is a fight down the rankings, because Chippy Mariscal on the unranked area of the rankings probably is ranked lower than Jack Jenkins, but I still think this would be a very, very fun fight. It would just be a banger. It would be a banger to open up the early prelims, and I think it would be a good matchup. I really would like to see this fight be made. These other options, of course, maybe there's potentially better options, but I like the matchup. Now we've got Junior Tuffa, Justin Tuffa's younger brother. Now, I do believe on Instagram, Junior Tuffa posted that he's got a contract signed. So we know that Junior Tuffa has a fight coming up, but we don't know who it's against. And I'm just going to guess it's against Chris Barnett. I looked at the UFC rankings, and I'm going to be honest, Junior Tuffa, because he couldn't get past Muhammad Usman, I'm not that sold that he's going to be able to get past, like, a lot of other people. You know what I mean? So I think this is a good fight. I think Junior Tuffa versus Chris Barnett is a very, very winnable fight for Junior Tuffa, because you do have to consider this. Junior Tuffa is very inexperienced in MMA. I think it's like 4-1 as a professional, which is crazy, and now he's in the UFC. But Chris Barnett is like very, very experienced, but he's also a striker. And if you guys don't know, we're talking about Junior Tuffa, who's a former top 10 glory kickboxer, like very, very high level kickboxer outside of the UFC, outside of MMA as a sport as it is. And Chris Barnett's just a Taekwondo black belt, very good striker, you know, he can wrestle and grapple. But this would be a fun fight. It would just be a fun fight to open up the early prelims as a heavyweight fight. Junior Tuffa taking on Chris Barnett. I mean, I'd love to see the fight. I think it's a good fight. You know, Julian Tuffer maybe has something to prove after losing his debut to Mo Usman. I really thought he was going to destroy Mo Usman. So I think Julian Tuffer's definitely got something to prove to a bunch of people that he can kind of hang in the UFC. And I think this would be a good fight. A striking fight for Tuffer. I think that makes all the sense in the world. And then to open up the card, it's a little bit of an odd one. Tom Nolan taking on Gabriel Miranda. Now, you're going to probably think to yourself, who is Tom Nolan? Well, Tom Nolan is being confirmed to be on Dana White's Contender Series this year. And he's a guy from Australia. He's an Australian on Dana White's Contender Series this year. And Gabriel Miranda is a guy that took on Benoit Saint-Denis on short notice. I believe it was last year in France. And he got absolutely dominated. I don't know if Gabriel Miranda wants to keep fighting. But this is like, Gabriel Miranda is the kind of guy who you would just feed to a Dana White's Contender Series prospect coming up. So just give him Tom Nolan. It makes sense. Tom Nolan, I believe, if he does win on Dana White's Contender Series and if he does get a contract, I think he should probably debut at UFC 293 in Australia. I think it would make sense. I think this fight does kind of make sense. Very winnable fight for Tom Nolan, by the way, which is why it's kind of perfect, to be honest. But yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking. You could also kind of look at other unsigned Australian prospects. I think Joseph Luciano really kind of comes to mind. Maybe he's on Dana White's Contender Series. Maybe Aaron Toe from New Zealand is on Dana White's Contender Series himself. You know, you got to think about maybe like Dan Hooker. But Dan Hooker is taking on Jalen Turner, and I'm just really worried about that matchup. There's other fighters as well. Jacinta Austin, you know, could be signed to the UFC very soon. That could be a good fight as well, good option. There's options out there, like Matt Viley as well, Brogan Anderson from New Zealand, just guys on the regional scene that could be signed to the UFC and then fight on this card. So there's definitely other options that you could do, but this is the card that I've put together. I think this is like the perfect Australian UFC 293 card. It doesn't have Jake Matthews on it, but I mean, you could put Jake Matthews on it, but I didn't really think of him until after I made the card, and I was like, oh, man, like, I've already got all of my fights, and I wanted to have at least one debut on the card, so Jake Matthews versus someone could make sense as well, but this is the card that I've put together. Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you haven't already, please do subscribe to my channel. I'm going to be making a lot of videos over the next few weeks or so. I'm going to be live streaming a lot, so now's a pretty good time to be subscribed to my channel, and with that being said, I will see you guys in the next video. Thank you guys so much for making it all the way to the end of the video. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one. Thank you for watching.